Hello and welcome. In this lecture, we will examine the question of impaired infants and the ethics of allowing such infants to die by withholding treatment or assisting in their death. The reading for this section comes out of Chapter 6 of Intervention and Reflection textbook and also includes the Peter Singer article entitled Justifying Infanticide. This conversation is closely related to the three preceding lectures: genetic control, reproductive control, and abortion. If you're new to the channel, or if you're not already familiar with these topics, I suggest going back to take a look at those first, to give you some context on the discussion. We start with the general terminology and other features, and then move on to the articles themselves. When dealing with this topic, we are generally limiting our discussion to severely impaired infants in the neonatal stage suffering from either genetic or congenital disabilities. That is, we're not focusing heavily on abortion or on children who have become disabled. Discovery of impairments is usually possible during the pregnancy by a variety of tests noted in our discussion on genetic control. Different tests can be done at different times, but a number of them do fall outside of the first trimester, meaning that the traditional line of demarcation noted in Roe v. Wade is not very helpful here. For impairments discovered during the pregnancy, abortion can be used to resolve the problem, speaking technically, not morally. But for those that are discovered only with the birth of the child, for any reason, a whole slew of ethical questions arise. Here are some of the questions that arise as a result of live births of significantly impaired infants. Should such infants be provided with extraordinary care or merely ordinary care and let nature take its own course? If no special effort should be made to ensure the survival, should we at least engage in providing comfort and ease for their death? Who should decide what the interests of the child are in making such decisions? Can acting in the best interest of the child also include deliberately not acting to save or to extend their life, i.e. letting them die? Should all efforts be made to integrate the surviving child into civic life, even if those efforts increase the suffering of the child? Does the infant have the same moral standing as a person? And how do we make that call? On the basis of development or the potential for development? If on the basis of actual development, then a properly developing fetus is generally further along than an impaired child. If on the basis of future development, then the infant may have no potential. And finally, how do we determine who is and is not a person? As you can see, these are not easy questions to grapple with, which is why so many theories argue for permitting abortion in such cases. Frankly, it's easier to grapple with abortion than with the issues of what happens after the birth. Next, we get into the question of responsibilities, divided up into our four familiar groups. The question of parental responsibility is multifaceted here. There is the responsibility of allowing such a child to be born, as per other topics we've already covered. Then there is the responsibility of what to do once such a child is born, and here it gets really messy. The answers provided by our textbook seem oddly disconnected from reality. Having had experience dealing with people who've gone through some of these issues while they were going through them, the reality of the situation as presented by the textbook is just poorly noted. The emotional anguish is absolutely extreme. On the one hand, you have the argument that, well, the child is not fully a person, so it's easier. And on the other hand, the responsibility is squarely on the parents, one of whom has just undergone childbirth, which is one of the most physically and mentally grueling processes known to humanity. All the options are ugly. In the cases of anencephaly and other such problems that are inoperable and inevitably end in death, nature has at least made the choice a bit simpler for the parents. Nothing can be done. Imagine the experience of a parent. There's some small chance that the child can be saved. You likely don't bother asking about the quality of life or the cost. You just say yes, and a team of surgeons operates on a child no bigger than your two hands. Cutting, clamping, suctioning off blood, digging around the tiny body to find and then attempt to correct the problem. The scalpel itself is larger than the child's head. Then you get the closing, incisions, sutures, staples, glue, trying to put that tiny body back together. And then it goes wrong. The heart stops, blood pressure skyrockets or plummets. Lungs stop or collapse, kidneys shut down, blood vessels burst. And so, as a parent, you give them the go-ahead for the next round of surgery. You hope and you wait as the infant is carved up on the table, and then the problems start again. Machines are holding the body alive, doing the work that the body should be doing. Then the heart fails, so it's defibrillation or adrenaline shots or both. Life comes back but fades again, and then the paddles and the needles come out again. The surgeon and the nurses look as haggard as you feel, and then they tell you, look, we can keep on doing this. We can keep bringing her back to life with adrenaline shots, but we can't fix what's wrong with her. And as soon as we stop keeping the body artificially alive, she's going to pass away. But it's up to you. We'll do whatever you want to do. Now, you go ahead and make that call. And then have somebody tell you that it's so obvious, you should just clearly do X. Or have them tell you that when the same issue is detected in utero next time, you should just go ahead and have that child. Maybe, if that's your religious belief, you can withstand the pain. But for most people, it's unbearable enough the first time. Don't ask them to do it again if they can prevent it, and the outcome is known ahead of time. The responsibilities of the child come into play with less extreme of the extreme issues here, because the assumption is that the child has to be able to survive the infancy and has at least minimally functional cognitive capacities in order for there to be a responsibility of the child. But will that child be capable for being responsible for themselves? In nearly all cases here, the answer is no. That means in terms of patient responsibility, that responsibility will have to be legally handed off to a parent or guardian, and the state will become the guardian in some cases. So again, we go to the responsibilities of the parents in dire situations. We've covered the issue here in our lecture on genetic control, so we'll just skip it. Medical responsibilities in these cases have a rather broad range. There's the responsibility to keep the patient alive, at least if that's the desire of the parents. Then there is the responsibility to let die if it goes the other way. There might also be a responsibility to euthanize if that's a call and if it's legal, and the responsibility to inform and advise parents. Again, we've noted most of the details of these responsibilities before, so we'll omit them here. As noted in our earlier lectures, there is a social responsibility and cost dealing with impaired infants. Responsibilities include things like making accessible all areas of civic life for disabled individuals. But the costs include the literal cost of upkeep. Given the medical cost of treatments, even where available, most parents are unable to bear that financial burden. That means that either the state steps in and pays the cost in some way from your taxes, or the state has to deal with the cost of their member going into bankruptcy from the costs, and then having to take up the slack itself, because we don't really let infants die on the street. Since the severely impaired infants require a lot of care, the costs get astronomical in a hurry. That is, money spent on one child whose future contributions are generally limited. And that's fine to some extent because, as we noted, this is the social contract trade-off. No one is happy just letting people die because they're costly and unproductive for any reason. And part of that comes from the fact that we too might end up in a similar state, or even just get old enough that our contribution ceases. And since we don't want to be killed off, we don't want to support that attitude towards others, and that's a pretty decent self-preservation tactic. Yet it is the state and society, the other people, who often become responsible for impaired infants. This is because the impairments often enough require permanent care, and the family who bears that responsibility can be outlived by the impaired infants, and in that case the responsibility falls back onto the state. But the extreme cost is where some kind of math enters the equation. Sake of argument, let's say we have baby X, and let's say that we can keep baby X alive. Let's even say that we can get her to full functionality, but the cost is the entire GDP of our nation. That is, the whole nation is going to hit financial ruin to keep baby X alive. So a whole lot of other people are going to suffer in the extreme. Homeless people might die of starvation. Forget any government-funded institutions, the Medicare, the food programs, the foreign aid to keep people abroad from dying of dysentery and easily preventable diseases and everything else, and so on, because baby X was kept alive. Is that morally justified? If you answered no, and you should all have answered no because otherwise you literally traded lives of other children for this one life, that tells us that there is a line somewhere that separates the cost of keeping someone alive from morally obligatory, or at least morally good, from morally unjustifiable or morally bad. Now, what this line is and where exactly it lies is the question, but that it is there should be clear. So what do our ethical theories say on the matter? Utilitarians, unsurprisingly, say that impaired infants should be allowed to die, or even helped along out of benevolence. Rules utilitarians might argue that the general rule should be to save every child where possible, but since those rules do allow for exceptions, that may provide a functional differentiation between different cases of impairment. Kantian ethics would depend on the answer to the question, is the infant a person? If yes, then they have human dignity, that is, rights, and those have to be respected, so no infanticide and yes, all care. If not, then we don't really have a good answer. Ross would argue that one should be allowed to die depending on degree of impairment and suffering, which gives us little guidance except for the absolute worst cases, since the line of permissibility hinges on the quality of the impairment and suffering, which is not at all clear. Natural law insists that all humans, from zygote onwards, are full persons with full rights. That said, the official position is that one is morally required to provide ordinary care to infants. That is, you can't withhold it. However, going above the ordinary care is not a moral necessity. Our textbook doesn't mention Rawls again, but just as with previous issues, one can assume that the answer is a limited yes. The limits are likely to be governed by social agreements, things like the social cost of dealing with such instances. Alright, so on to the readings. John A. Robertson offers us an argument from a natural law perspectives, but one tempered with utilitarian concerns of the arguments that he set against. He tackles the question of the person and non-person distinction and the utilitarian calculus approach. He begins by noting that the attribution of non-personhood has had a historically bad set of consequences. Slavery, racism, oppression, and even extermination of peoples based on their lack of personhood is the standard in human history, not the exception. And for this reason, he argues that the distinction should not be made. It is enough that one has human parents. It is enough that one is a Homo sapien. Now note that Singer argued that mere belonging to Homo sapiens is not good enough. He said that this distinction is arbitrary because we are assigning rights to this chunk of matter and not some other one because of some accidental feature. But Robertson makes a decent point here. This inclusion is not arbitrary because drawing that non-person line has very significant moral implications. Now, perhaps if the demarcation was not commonly used for justification of atrocities, Singer's point would stand. But as it is, mere belonging should be good enough to prevent future atrocities. That said, Robertson takes Tooley's argument for such demarcation under advisement. Now, Tooley argued that the definition of a person should be conditioned on a concept of, quote, continuing self with a desire to keep existing. This excludes severely impaired infants who do not develop a sense of self. The immediate problem is that this dilemma also includes anyone who's sleeping, comatose, and suffering from an extreme psychotic episode, and so on. So Tooley amends the definition to include everyone who will achieve such a state. But now he has included fetuses because this definition is premised on the future state of events. So Tooley amends it again. Now the baseline is moved to those who have already achieved this sense of continuing self. And in this way, it's a matter of getting to that point, which then confers personhood on the individual. But this is problematic too. For one thing, it seems arbitrary. For another, what do we do about individuals who have achieved a continuing sense of self, but then who develop mental impairments or fall into a persistent vegetative state? Do they then lose personhood, or is it a once-and-done deal? What about infants whose impairments are severe but are not affecting their mental faculties? And what about mental defects that can't be detected for months after birth? How does this definition that Tooley gives us here help us when the infant is born and the question of care needs answering right then and there? Ultimately, Robertson concludes that Tooley's position gives us marginal guidelines at best for cases that are already in the generally obvious category. Robertson's argument against the quality of life utilitarian position has two problematic features. First, there is a problem that we cannot know the wishes of other people. Actually, if we want to be literal about it, we cannot know anyone's wishes, even if they communicate. And this is a problem in postmodernism that resists all solutions. Link in the description. Yet we make decisions to do this anyway. We have tools like power of attorney for life and death decisions. We have DNRs, and we have general medical guidelines for comatose patients whose wishes are otherwise unknown. You have to assume that we can in fact know the wishes of others, otherwise the whole thing falls apart. Next, he has a concluding statement on the question of negative utilitarian value on family. It does not follow that this requires non-treatment, right? Speaking of impaired infants. And I'll agree that it does not follow that the problem requires non-treatment, but then it doesn't follow that it mandates treatment either. The idea, as Singer would likely point out, is that the option should be available, that the individual families should have the option to terminate or not depending on their context, and the same holds true for abortion. The argument is not that one should be forced to end a life, only that they should have the option of doing so. Finally, there's a question of utilitarian argument for limits on spending money on saving a life. And Robertson argues that the money that would otherwise socially be spent is not going to other people anyway. So the fact that we spend extraordinary money on one life does not mean that there's any harm done. Society doesn't suffer for it. But I think this is a bad argument, and he's presenting the best case, the everyday scenario, and then is going off of that. And I don't think that that's a very valuable way of presenting it. So let's look at it a little bit deeper. Take the example of a local charity, maybe a church, a mosque, a 501(c)(3) that financially helps out parents of children who need medical interventions. Their funds are limited, so are their options. Realistically, they're helping one family or they're helping 15 families. And this isn't help in the sense of life or death. This is help in whether or not the family goes bankrupt. So how should they allocate their funds? Or since coronavirus is big in the news now, let's imagine a scenario where resources are limited. You don't really have to imagine it, it's already here. And so let's say we have 2 infants, both of whom need respirators to stay alive. You have 1 respirator. One infant is an ordinary child, the other is a severely impaired infant. Who gets the respirator? Living in the affluent West, we tend to forget that resources are in fact limited. But as this crisis is teaching us, there is in fact a hard limit, and at that point you are forced to clarify your answers to some moral questions in a hurry. We can no longer delay facing the issue because the patient is dying. Should the doctor treat child A or child B? And why? In our second article, Tristam Engelheardt Jr. offers a utilitarian argument for permissibility of letting impaired infants die and aiding them along in that process. Now that part is easy to understand since utilitarianism has a relatively easy access to justifying such actions. Just make sure that the action is in the best interest of the happiness greater than pain layout. There are 2 points, however, that Engelheardt makes that seem to go really wide of the mark and actually undermine his entire argument, so I'll just focus on those. The first issue is the idea that children belong to their families, that they are persons only in the social sense that others act on their behalf. This position has more than a few drawbacks, which is why it has been phased out of legal use. In fact, in Judaism, it was phased out in the 7th century BC, as noted in Deuteronomy 21:18-21. If children belong to families, then they get reduced to objects. If they are objects, then people have the right to treat their objects as they see fit. I mean, I can smash my computer here with impunity. But if I abuse a child, even an infant just out of the womb with no sense of self yet, we have extreme punishments. If the infant is my property, then I should be able to sell it, right? That's how it's worked in places where that attitude persisted. Now maybe Singer is right in that the harm is no different between adult or child. Perhaps even that harming an adult is worse and that we shouldn't favor children over adults. However, the punishment is still there, i.e. we do give infants a full set of rights. They're not in fact considered possessions. Additionally, the state takes away children from abusive parents on the grounds of the rights of the child. And we also do so in the case of parental death. That is, the child belongs to the family, but only insofar as that family is present and capable of executing a basic standard of care. So the child actually belongs to the ethical standard which the state enforces, and which must be adequately executed in order to retain one's rights as the caretaker of the child. All of this, at least in theory. And thus this property of family line is a bad one, unless you want to open up that entire can of worms about humans as objects, in which case the responsibility of the state to protect the children also goes right out the window. There are simply better ways to make the argument for the ultimate responsibility and rights of parents to make the call. The second issue is on the line that we have no respect for the wishes and the freedom of newborns. This is a factually wrong statement on one point and technically wrong on the other. As psychologist Dr. Peterson points out, from the psychological perspective, the only functionally correct way to treat a child that will not cause severe harm is as if they are always right. And we do that for the first 6 months after their birth. In fact, these are the medical guidelines, especially if the child is in a hospital. Why so? Because the child is unable to otherwise communicate. They know what they want and they scream for it. If they feel hungry now, they are right, and you better treat it that way. If they want to be held and rocked for the next 15 hours straight, then they are right, and you better treat it that way. They absolutely know what they do and don't want. That's why they stop screaming bloody murder when they get it, and keep going if you give them the wrong thing. And we absolutely do treat their wishes as having more weight than the wishes of adults taking care of them. The freedom of the child is also a right, and one we enforce. If someone else takes the child away without consent, we call that kidnapping, the taking and holding of an infant against the wishes of the designated caretaker. Thus, the freedom of the child is as protected as that of an adult. But because the infant is temporarily unable to take care of themselves or speak on their own behalf, a caretaker is appointed to speak and act on their behalf. This denial of freedom for the infant is no different than denying the freedom to an adult who's experiencing a psychotic break and trying to harm themselves, or one that's suffering from a fairly bad stroke. It is on the basis of respect for their freedom, when sane and capable and acting with basic understanding, that we do actually protect them. Yes, it is paternalistic, but it is necessary. The same issue is resolved without problem in cases of medical care. A patient can't just wander off, nor can somebody simply make off with a patient in the care of the hospital. So this idea of premising personhood on specific attributes makes a lot of sense, but it has a very dark past. As soon as we make that call, it makes things a lot easier in some ways, but it opens up a Pandora's box of bad. If we don't make that call, we introduce additional suffering for everyone. With that, let's take a look back at the 4 topics we've covered so far, those being genetic control, reproductive control, abortion, and impaired infants. When we look at genetic control, it is designed to negate or minimize the number of impaired infants, but it necessitates abortion, or increases the odds of it anyway. Reproductive control works with genetic control. It too negates or minimizes impaired infants and limits abortions for certain cases, but it increases it for others. On the topic of abortion, we pose questions of who is a person, who has what rights. This affects our genetic and reproductive control issues. It can be used to minimize impaired infants. It can be used to minimize utilitarian negative consequences on parents and society. It increases the problem of who is responsible for the fetus. It raises the problem of autonomy. And it raises the problem of how to split the difference between mother, father, and child in terms of autonomy and rights. And finally, on the topic of impaired infants, we're back to the question of personhood. Then we have the problem with the fact that the end of life commonly moves past abortion into infanticide-type situations. The costs when dealing with impaired infants tend to get extraordinarily high, and social costs are also high. So in theory, we can structure the relation of these 4 issues as follows. Preventing impaired infants seems to be the general goal here, because impairments are a negative for parents, children, medical field, and society. That does not mean that the impaired and disabled persons are in any way less human, or that they have any less rights, or should have any less space in society. It just means that the impairment and disability impose additional costs in every sense on everyone involved. To most effectively prevent impaired infants, we can use genetic control to screen and counsel prospective parents, as well as fetuses, to ascertain risks, to identify problems early on, and so on. We can also use reproductive control to select embryos that are the least likely to be problematic down the road. And then we can use abortion to additionally discard the problematic outcomes and limit impaired infants. The main issue that arises is the willingness to use abortion, which is at the root of many of these preventative policies. Thus, if abortion is a problem, then so are all the procedures, at least partially. We can still use genetic control to screen and dissuade prospective parents from pregnancy if they're likely to produce impaired children. We can use these screenings as an early warning for prospective parents to get them ready and prepared for what to expect. This is especially true for cases of severe but non-fatal impairments, which would give them the time to learn about the issue, apply for the kind of help that they're likely to need, and so on. Similarly, with reproduction control, we can still create and select embryos that are least likely to be problematic. We can obviate the need for selective abortions due to multiple fetuses by implanting one at a time, though that's likely to require more treatment and run at a higher cost. But we're still left with the problem of extreme cases like anencephaly, which cannot be dealt with and always result in the death of an infant. There's also the issue of extreme costs, of social costs, and such that must be addressed meaningfully no matter the position on abortion, because the every life is worth saving attitude is naive and frankly not functional unless you happen to live in the most advanced nations in the world. That same pitch is just not going to work when you go to a third world country. And unless you want to make your morality based on location, technology, and funds, a sign that you're not really talking about morality but about privilege, that argument is going to fall rather flat. This concludes our lecture on the set of modules that are closely tied to the questions of abortion. I'm sure it will come up again, but in a less central role as we move on past the questions of fetuses and infants. If you have any questions or comments, feel free to leave them in the comment section or shoot me an email. Thank you.